Why do you do the work you do? I recently was at an event, spoke a few times in the last couple weeks, but at one event in particular, I led with that question. And it's interesting to see the look on people's faces when you ask that question. Because for some of us, the answer comes very naturally. For others, it's a little more complicated. And usually it's not complicated because we don't know the answer. It's complicated because we aren't sure how to articulate it in a way that will keep the interest of the person we're speaking to. Welcome to Brand on the Rocks, the podcast that distills bold ideas into clear messages you can actually use. Each week, we serve up conversations, audits, and straight pours of insight to help you cut through the noise and grow your business. Hosted by brand strategist Ryan Holck, this is where clarity comes neat and your brand gets remembered. Today, I want to talk about our origin story, specifically the why behind what you do in your business. What is it that drives you to actually solve the problem you solve, to get in front of people, to wake up each morning and say, I want, as a business owner, as a business leader, to help people in this way. So I've really put together a kind of a framework and a process for how we can think about our own story, how we can put it into some context for the people who are listening to us, and then how we can actually assemble the pieces. So this is some of the content really that I kind of put together for a couple different talks recently and kind of a hybrid of that because I want to walk you through this process. And this is going to be one of those don't just listen podcasts. This is going to be, you're probably going to want to grab a piece of paper, maybe take some notes and think about some of what I have to share in the next few minutes, because the reality is your business has the potential to bring change and make the life better of the people you serve. But the only way you're ever going to have that opportunity is the story you're sharing is so clear that the people on the other end actually understand the words that you're using. So let's take a couple minutes and let's dive into this. Growing up, our family used to camp, and there was lots of cool things that we did while we were camping. We did a lot of fishing. We did hiking. As kids, we would kind of wave goodbye to the parents in the morning and we'd just go disappear into the hills and throw rocks and use slingshots. And we had a Red Ryder BB gun that we toted around a lot of the time. And the whole idea you might shoot your eye out. Yeah, we almost did that a couple times. So there actually some truth to that statement in that movie. But we loved the experience. But one of the things that was so memorable about camping wasn't just the way we spent our days. It was the way we spent our evenings. That once fishing was done and we had kind of cleaned up and had dinner, we'd sit around the campfire and we'd share stories. And around the campfire, oftentimes the stories that got told were funny family stories or stories of past camping experiences. We often heard from my dad, who would share about camping as a kid and what it was like in a large family with a giant old Army surplus tent to go and camp and some of the funny things that happened. And what was so fantastic about those stories was not that there was a moment that was life-changing about it. But it was a moment that it reconnected us to why we were doing the kind of trips we were doing, what it was about our family that was so important. And that was time together, and it was sharing stories and having an idea really of where we had come from. Because stories don't just help you with memories. They are really how people remember you. A lot of how I remember our family, especially the extended family who didn't live nearby, was through the stories that got told. So I'm curious, when someone thinks about you, when they think about your business, what stories do they tell? In the absence of a clear story, people tend to fill the gaps. They tend to either make stuff up, which is usually not really good, or they tend out of confusion to kind of hem and haw, and all of a sudden the phrase has happened way too many times because they aren't sure how to clearly articulate what it is that you do when they talk about you. If I was to go around the room and I've done this and ask people, what do you sell? Tell me about it. It's fascinating because you go around the room and most people sound very similar. They can be in completely different niches, selling completely different products, but there is a lack of clarity as to how we talk with specificity about what makes us different, our unique contribution to the world, to our business, and how our version of the widget we sell is really the better option available. And it's fascinating to see this in real time where businesses struggle with this. I functioned as kind of the head of marketing for a solar company that was in Northern California for a while. And they had a wide suite of product offerings. It all fell under green energy, but there was battery backups, there was solar panels on your roof, there was heating for swimming pools, like so that you could have warmer water longer periods of time through the year, just kind of different angles. But where they really struggled was having a core story that tied all the pieces together. And it's one of the things that we worked on honestly for several months trying to get focused, because when the owner would get on a sales call and he'd be talking to a potential customer, his close rate was phenomenally high. It was super high because he adjusted as to how he was going to share very quickly, because he could pivot. But his sales teams, even though they were qualified, struggled to pivot because they did not have shared language or shared understanding of how all of the pieces really fit together. And the challenge was they were bringing in lots of leads. They were spending lots of money on advertising. And if you put the leads in front of the right one or two people, they almost closed 2 to 3 times more than others. And so their acquisition costs were just through the roof. And what it really came down to was they had to figure out what the clear language was that they were going to talk about, why they existed and why they were solving this problem and how it made people's world better. When they talked to tech people, they tended to do better. When they talked to normal people who couldn't think abstractly or didn't understand all the tech jargon, they lost people really fast. So one of the things we've got to do in our businesses when we sit down to think about how are we going to share, specifically how are we going to share why we do what we do, we've got to figure out how to harness the right stories and think about the way that people might engage with them and how to put the words in front of people. And part of that comes down to repetition. We have got to have a story, or at least a story framework in our minds that is so easy to share that it's easily repeated. So I watched the show called Duck Dynasty for a number of years, off and on. We were not one of those show up every week and watch it, but we did watch them a fair amount. And there was a main character on there. His name was Phil Robertson. He was kind of the grandfather, the patriarch of the family and of the business. And he had a story that I've seen him share across multiple different places over the years. I've seen him share it in super short clips. I've seen him in interviews expand it to 5 and 10 minutes, so it's much more expansive. But what I learned in watching him tell stories was that he had some core elements that he knew had to be included every time he'd tell a story. But he had some other things that could be added or subtracted based on the context and how much people knew about him as a person or the family or the situation. And so there was this flexibility in his storytelling. But at the end of the day, there was some key things that he told every time he shared the story. And one of those stories specifically was about a moment where he caught some people stealing and poaching some of what his family had trapped and caught. And then he had this moment where he had to decide, how am I going to respond to these people that I have caught in the act of doing this? And so what I learned kind of picking apart and reverse engineering his storytelling was that there was 3 simple things that he was doing. He did not make it complicated. He had a simple outline that he followed. There were 3 or 4 key elements he was going to repeat every time he told a story, and then there was some subsequent potential elements that could be added. Okay. And what that showed me is that he knew what his story was with the core of what had to be, but that he then was really willing and able to adapt its delivery based on who he was standing or sitting across from. And that's one of the things that I'm noticing more and more with the businesses I'm serving is that we tend to approach our storytelling with I need to have every word memorized kind of approach to storytelling, that it's almost got to be a rote verbatim, I'm going to share it right this minute kind of thing. And in the process, it ends up coming across cold and sterile because it's not responsive to the people we're actually with. We just it's like hitting play on your playlist and the song just plays. Okay. Without any thinking about who might be listening, what they might care about, or even waiting for responses from them. And so what I realized is he's adapting the delivery. He's thinking really intently about how did they ask that question? Who are they? Do they what pieces of our life in this story might they understand? What pieces might need to be filled in so that they can understand at a deeper level? So a simple outline, he was willing to adapt the delivery, and really he owned the story. He made it his. And what I mean by that is that he didn't add bells and whistles or things that really weren't important. He just told the story like it was his own because it was. And he owned it. So when he shared it, you didn't care if he paused. You didn't find yourself having those ADD squirrel moments where your brain kind of goes sideways because he was sharing it in such a way that it was really just compelling and it was conversational. And in the process of recognizing that pattern of 3 things with him, I really, it drove home for me the idea that we don't need new stories every time we sit in front of a group. Every time we step up to a microphone, every time we sit on a podcast, every time we are invited to a networking event, we don't have to create or invent new stories about who and what we are. We need a few core stories that we can repeat at volume, but in different ways, because I heard him share this story several times. I heard it in different ways. Every time I heard it, it was still engaging. I did not tune out because I'd heard it before, because it did not feel like he had hit play and repeated verbatim. It felt like it was contextual and it was still compelling to listen to. So if that's the power of repetition, how do we really make a story worth repeating? What is it that helps us, especially as we're going to dive into origin story here and our why? What is it that makes that story worth repeating, that when someone hears it, they go, I think I could actually maybe explain this to someone else of the reason this business exists or what they're trying to accomplish. And I learned a couple lessons from some comedians, specifically from Jeff Foxworthy and Bert Kreischer. And this was a podcast interview of the two of them hanging out. And if you've not seen that podcast interview, I would invite you to go find the YouTube of it. It's quite fascinating to watch the two of them go back and forth. If you're not familiar with them, it's all right. The context of this story will still be fine. But it's fascinating to see how their brains think and how they think about storytelling and delivering story in ways that's compelling for people. But as Foxworthy is being interviewed and he's sharing a little bit, the brilliance of the interview, in my opinion, is where he really dives into what it takes to make a story work. Because if you listen to a lot of comedians or even a few comedians, they oftentimes talk about the process of developing a story. What does it take to write a story idea on a note card and then figure out how you're going to share that story in a way that is compelling, that people actually still listen to, that eventually becomes part of, say, a 10 to 12 minute story or bit on one of their shows? And what is that process? And how do you figure out what does and doesn't work? And just like Phil Robertson, I kind of had three takeaways. I had three takeaways from this lesson. And I think it's important for us to think about as we consider, okay, we need to have a story that's repeatable, but not just a story that's repeatable. We've got to have a story that people actually want to repeat and share with others. And so the takeaways that I got from Foxworthy specifically were that you need to have a story that's easy to share. And what I mean by that is not that it's simple. It's that the secret is that your audience should be able to walk away after having heard it and repeat it to someone else. That if they heard it last night at a show, they potentially could go and while they're pouring a cup of coffee today, share it with someone else. Okay. Jeff Foxworthy is known for his redneck jokes. You know, you might be a redneck and so they all had very short punchlines. If you remember, there used to be a whole bit about Hot Pockets that was connected to, now I'm blanking on his name, one moment, to Jim Gaffigan. So if you remember, there was Hot Pockets was a whole bit that was connected to Jim Gaffigan. And what really came down really to the core of those two things is that they had easy to share stories, that they took all the complexity and they figured out at the end of the day, how can I articulate this really simply so people get it? Not just so it's funny, because oftentimes our stories, especially our origin and why our business exists, it's probably not going to be a comedian level funny kind of story. There may be humorous moments, but the whole idea is that, hey, I've done the work of figuring out how to share this to you in a way that is going to be easy to remember. And the next lesson that I learned from Foxworthy in this was that figure out how to tell your story in one sentence. And it's not that you will usually share it in one sentence, is that you need to know actually what the core idea of your darn story is. Foxworthy said specifically, learning to tell something in one sentence made him a better story writer. The same thing will make you a better storyteller. Okay. And we're going to circle back to this concept here in just a moment. But the last thing was actually a idea that Foxworthy learned from Jay Leno of all people. And that was that Jay told him to cut everything that's unnecessary, that every extra word weakens the story. Now, taking kind of a zoom back from that, I recognize that we are not standing on stage at a comedy show trying to get a laugh. And so there is some push and pull to that last one a little bit. But the big idea is really, I don't want to lose people in the process of sharing this story. If I put too many details in that don't matter to the listener, I will lose them. Okay, that's what worked in the Phil Robertson version of being able to adapt his story, was he recognized where might I lose people so that I don't go there in the concept. Okay. So those are three ideas from really Jeff Foxworthy. It's got to be easy to share. You got to tell it in one sentence. You got to be efficient with your words. So how does this apply to really our origin stories? Because that's really where I want to get to today, and where you as a business leader, you as a business owner, especially if you've got a large team and you've got to figure out how to help them understand where you guys came from and what work you're doing. We got to figure out how to articulate this in a way that really makes sense to tell the why behind what we do. Because most origin stories don't fail because they're unimportant. They fail because they're too long. They're too detailed. They're too close to the person telling them, and we get emotional or lose ourselves in the telling, and details that are important to us aren't necessarily important to the listener. Okay. So think about this for a moment. Have you ever stood in front of a group of people and shared something with them, and when you closed your mouth, you realized, I think I shared too much. I may have overshared in that moment, or I feel like I lost the room at some point. What happened? They were with me and then they weren't. Okay. So the goal for the next few minutes, and I'm going to walk you through this framework that I've got and give you some pointers on how you can apply this to your story, is not to make your story fancier. Okay. It's to make your story usable so that you can get in front of people and you can actually share what matters to you in a way that it will matter to them. Okay. So, as context, I want to share a little bit about my story. Okay. So, for those of you who maybe have followed me for a while or you're new to the podcast, even the heart of what I do, I've been doing for 20 plus years. But in the summer of 2013, I attended a conference. And conferences are one of the places that I have recognized that life change moments tend to happen. But in 2013, I had not quite come to that realization. I was 9 years into a marketing communications role at a large nonprofit. Things were going okay. I was pretty happy with the work that I was doing. I assumed that that was kind of the pattern and where we were headed for the future. I expected this week of this conference to be lots of learning and growth and networking opportunities. I was going to come, learn some stuff, go home, and life would continue. But during a keynote, a guy by the name of Gary Molander got up and shared a story. And during his keynote, he shared specifically about a moment as a kid where he struggled with a bully. And that bully impacted his life for a significant season. But in the process, he learned a powerful lesson that came really from his dad. And that was that in life's biggest and smallest moments, you probably can't get rid of the fear completely, but you can put it in the trunk and take it for the ride. Now, that statement in hindsight doesn't seem like a lot. Well, that's a great idea. If fear's a problem, how can I manage it? But what that statement said to me and what it led me to in the following weeks and months was a recognition that I was content in what I was doing, and it was largely because of fear of change. And so that fear of change led my wife and I to look at our life and say, we've declared we want to be people who make an impact. We want to serve others. I don't think sitting in the chair as a communications director at a single nonprofit is going to have the impact we really truly desire for our lives. And it led me to recognize that I needed to go and work for myself. I needed to launch a company. And so I did. I went out and launched an agency and started working with nonprofits and small businesses, and eventually Distill Your Story, which is part of Brand on the Rocks podcast that you're listening to today. So in a weird kind of turn of events, you're sitting here listening today to something that's an extension of that moment in my life in 2013, 13 years ago. Okay. And so the interesting thing really about our origin or our why story is I could take you back 20 years. I could tell you why I'm in this work as a whole. I could tell you a lot of details, but I chose not to because I knew I had 90 to 120 seconds probably to share something that you may not completely connect with, but you at least could appreciate and would give you a little bit of my background and my heart for what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. And really, the reason that story works, the reason that story is compelling at any level is because it does a few things. And I want to walk you through my framework here, and then I will come back to the story I just shared and give you some kind of insights into how you can think about telling your story. Okay. So there are 6 things that you need to think about when it comes to the stories you tell in your business. Okay. The first one is you got to pick one story to tell. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes we could start a lot of places with a story. Okay. I could tell you any host of stories about how I ended up in marketing and communications. I had to pick in my mind the specific one I was going to approach for this moment of sharing. Okay. That's what this means. Pick one story, something that captures something that's true about you, that's a part of your life. Okay. Don't overthink this. Just know what the heck am I going to share? Like some loose parameters. The second thing is you got to know what it proves. And just like Phil Robertson had a sense of what story am I going to, this is the story I'm going to tell, and how I'm going to tell it is what's going to vary. Every good story has a reason for being told. There's a truth, there's a lesson, there's something that you want people to walk away with. And you need to know, when I share my origin story, I want them to walk away with X. When I share about my client testimonials, I want listeners to understand X. Okay. So the whole idea is just know what the whole story proves. Why are you even taking the time right now to share your story? Okay. The third part is you've got to document the details. And this is where things oftentimes get off the rails for workshops I teach, honestly, for individual clients, because we have a self editor and the self editor is strong. And what I mean by that is we don't start with as many details as possible. We start writing things down about potential stories, and we are editing out details before a single thing actually makes it to the piece of paper. So the process of documenting the details is I want you to get the details out of your head and onto a sheet of paper. Okay. This is not the time for editing. This is not the time for you figuring out, is this really important? Who would care about this detail? That's not the point of this moment. The point is, in this story, I could potentially share these 50 things. Put the darn 50 things on a piece of paper. Okay. Write them down. Document the potential details. It's a brain dump. Get it out of your head so you have something to look at. Often when it comes to clients, especially if we're doing interviews, we're sitting with a camera and doing some sort of video shoot. What this comes down to is I'm just going to ask you a bunch of questions to get you thinking, to get something out of you. And then let's figure out how to clean it up and say it concisely after we've at least gotten the details out. Because oftentimes the details that you think are important as the speaker are not the details that are going to connect with your audience. And you oftentimes need someone outside of yourself to look at the details and go, these are the 4 things I just walked away with. Those are the things you need to keep sharing over and over. Okay. So you're picking the story, you know what it proves, you're documenting the details, and then you're going to distill it down. This is where we get out our red pen. Okay. And we start thinking about what is important. What did I just share that people need to know right now? Right. And so oftentimes I'll look through all of the brain dump that we did and go circle, circle, circle. Those are the 4 or 5 things that are most important. Okay. Those are the things I have to make sure I include every time. Remember, Phil Robertson he had those 3 or 4 details that every time he shared the story got repeated. All the rest were insertables. Okay. You're trying to get to those 3 or 4 key things that need to be shared about your story. The 5th piece is you're going to adapt the delivery. And what that means is I want to have a list of the core elements and the potential elements. And I want to think, if I had to share this in 15 seconds, how would I do it? And where would I do it? Maybe that's a social channel. Maybe that's a reel, a video clip. Okay. Like, how would I tell this story in a super concise way? How would I tell it at a 30-second level? What additional details would I add? If I had a minute and a half, what additional details would I include? We're just figuring out how to adjust based on the audience, based on where it's going to land, whether it's written, it's read, it's on a podcast and you're spoken, how it's going to happen. Okay. And the 6th piece is, here's where we lose people. If you want your story to be repeatable, you've got to repeat your story. People will not remember it if they've only heard it one time. They'll remember highlight reel. Okay. They won't remember all the details. Think back to junior high, sitting in history class with your teacher telling you about the details about the 7th war you had read about in that class. You start losing context for, was that World War I? Was that World War II? When did that happen? Maybe that was Korea. Maybe that was Vietnam. Nope, that was, okay. All the details start blending together. So you've got to figure out, what are the things I'm going to repeat so that people remember them and keep them in context. Okay. All right. So those are the six pieces of this framework, and we're going to walk through, and I'm going to give you some ways right now to actually kind of parse through this and apply it to your story. Okay. So the first one is pick a story. Pick one story. So I just kind of gave you an overview of that. For this, I'd like you to think specifically about your origin story. The questions I'm going to give you here in a moment are connected to the why story that you've got to tell. Okay. The 6-part framework will work for any story you've got to tell in your business. Right now, we're going to talk origin story. Okay. So this is going to help you shape a story that's worth repeating. Okay. So pick one story. Remember, I mentioned in my story, I could have started you 20 plus years ago when I got into marketing and communications. I chose a story that started, in my case, in 2013. And what happened at that moment that transitioned me from being in the working for someone else to working for myself. Okay. So figure out for yourself what that story is. And I'm just going to tell you right now, if you don't have a piece of paper, go get a piece of paper, hit pause, go steal something off of the printer next to you, take a few moments and get a piece of paper. Okay. Now, the idea with this of picking a story is that you're building a story here that people are going to quickly understand. This is not a scrapbook version of every potential default way we could ever share this story. Okay. I just want to know what's the core version you're going to work on right now. If you've got 5 stories, I just did this live with a group of people and someone said, I have 5 different versions I could share. And I said, that's great. Pick one of the 5 for today, come back later and work on the other ones. Okay, so that's what I want you to do right now. Okay, so know what story you're going to pick. Now, know what the story proves. I already mentioned this. Okay, if my story helps people understand what about me, my origin story helps people understand what about me. Like, why are you going to actually take the time right now to share this version of your story? And if you're thinking, sometimes I share this story, sometimes a person on my team needs to share it, that's great. Your origin story helps the listener understand what if you're sharing it and what if one of your team members is sharing it. It's hopefully the same thing, but you just need to know, why are we going to take time, fill space, okay? And try and write that in one sentence. Like, what is the reason behind sharing this story? All right, so the details. This is where things get fun and they can get messy. Now, if we were doing this in a workshop, we would actually take time and we would spend 3 or 4 minutes per question, and you'd work through stuff and we'd break apart into groups and we'd actually like mastermind this together. But for the case of this, I'm just going to present these questions to you. There's no reason for you to have me pause for 3 minutes and be able to respond. That doesn't work in a podcast. But here's the document, the details. Okay. A set of questions for you to consider. Okay. What motivated you to start something new? What motivated you to start something new? What was the catalyst moment that pushed you to act? What was the catalyst moment that pushed you to? Number 3, what problem did you see that needed addressing? What problem did you see that needed addressing? Number 4, what barriers stood in your way? What barriers stood in your way? Number 5, what choice or solution emerged? What choice or solution emerged? If you're wondering what I mean by that, it's as you looked at the problem that you wanted to solve, what did it lead you to do? Okay. Did you made a choice to do something, you built a solution. What was that? Okay. Number 6, what changed because of it? What changed because of it? And number 7, what next step should a listener take or no? What next step should a listener take or no? So you've got those 7 questions. Here's what I would encourage you to do. Take a few minutes and answer those questions. And remember, this is a brain dump moment. This is not a self-editing moment. This is just get information out. Okay. I mentioned that I've done this several times live as workshops. I've seen moments where people have 1-sentence answers to one of these questions. And I have seen moments where people write a quarter of a sheet of information. Whichever version is, that's fine. The idea is to get the information out of your head, because it's not until you can oftentimes look at it that you can sort through it and really truly make sense of it. I can tell you, as someone who for years spent a lot of time processing only in his head, and it'd be like, that's the answer. That I oftentimes missed details in the long run because I hadn't documented. Or I, in my head, assumed I had shared a piece of information that actually had been part of what had been edited out, but I didn't realize it until it was too late. So just get the information out. Okay. Try and get all those raw ingredients out. So take a few moments, answer those questions for yourself. Okay. And then let's come back and let's distill them down. Okay. And I apologize if you can hear my dogs who are losing their mind in the backyard at this very moment. But let's think about how we're going to distill down these story elements. Okay. Here's what I want you to use as a filter for this next few minutes. Okay. You hopefully have a sheet of paper with your 7 questions and some answers. Okay. Could someone share this tomorrow and get the details mostly right? Okay. How could I make this easier for them to repeat? That's what I want you to use as a filter and as context for the next few moments. Okay. I want you to take your answers and I want you to go question by question and think about this. Is this information important to the audience or to me? Go through it. And if it's important to the audience, circle it. If it's mostly important to you, just leave it alone. Okay. So I want you to go through your 7 questions in the next few minutes, read it and think, is it important to me or to my audience? If it's important to your audience, circle it because that means it's worth highlighting. At the end of this, you should have a paper with a bunch of circles of things that you believe are the most important elements that potentially could be shared each time you share this story. And what I oftentimes encourage people to do is get a second sheet of paper and number the page to your 7 questions and just write what you circled. So you don't have to look at an entire document with lots of information. It's here's the 3 words in question 1 or the 2 phrases or the things that would trigger you in your mind to go, oh, right, that's the piece of this story I need to tell. Okay. And transfer that to a sheet where you can look at like a clean version where you just have those answers. Okay. So that's the distilling it down process. Okay. Now, what do we do with that? Well, for me, I'm in my 50s. I was a kid who grew up with Mad Libs. Mad Libs were a fun way you'd get a story, but there was fill in the blanks with the story. It would be put an adverb here, put a noun, put a a pronoun, whatever, into the blanks, and you'd read it and you'd end up with a story. And sometimes the stories were hysterical because they made no sense at all. And other times they were actually pretty straightforward and not all that amusing. But the process got something out of your head so you had something on paper. So this process here for you is not to have a perfect story. This process is to take the notes you've just said and get them in a framework where you have a rough draft that you can do something with. Okay. All right. Now, you'll notice in those questions that I asked you, those 7 questions that you now have a list of highlight information for, there were some keywords in each of those. Okay. Key things. And that's what I mean. Like in question number 1, the question was about motivation. Question number 2 was catalyst. Question number 3 was problem. Number 4 was barriers. Number 5 was choice or solution. Number 6 was changed. Number 7 was next step. Okay, so we're going to Mad Lib this, right? So here's what I want you to do. Write down this Mad Lib script, and then you're going to go back and fill it in. Okay. I was catalyst. When I noticed problem, I wanted to motivation, but barriers stood in the way. So I chose choice or solution, which changed what changed. I want you to know takeaway. Okay. I was catalyst. When I noticed problem, I wanted to motivation, but barriers stood in the way. I probably we'll put this in the show notes because I think it would be helpful for you to actually see it. So if you're going through this, check the notes and maybe if this is easier for you. But so I chose choice or solution, which changed, change. I want you to know takeaway. All right, you're saying, Ryan, what the heck are you getting at? Here's what I want you to walk away with right now. Okay. Think about the story that I shared. Okay. I was in a job I thought was going well, working for myself and at a conference when I noticed that I actually had a hidden version of fear in the background. I wanted my life to have impact, but the job I was at was going to be barrier to that happening or that being as broad as it could. So I chose to go work for myself, which changed my job and the type of work and people that I work for. I want you to know you are sitting here today as an extension of what happened to me 13 years ago. Okay. That's a quick version. Now, would I ever share that and expect you to walk away and go, I get what Ryan does? No. Once again, the purpose of this moment is to get a first draft of something that you can build off of. Okay. So take a few moments, look at your synopsis list, and start filling in the gaps. Fill in those blanks. Fill it in so you can start thinking, oh, here's at least a rough outline of this story that I could tell. And here's why I think about it this way. Rarely will you share the same story the same way 2 times ever. Like I mentioned, you're not a comedian. You are not telling this story rote. Your punchline does not have to be the same every time. The idea is to know which elements go where so that you share them in a compelling way and actually create tension in your sharing and take people someplace with you. All right. So take a few moments, write out a first version. Okay? Now, you're going to look at that and it's going to feel messy and you're going to feel like, I don't know that this process got me where it needs to be. Great. That's actually a good place because I need you to take a step back and assess the details I just put down, what's truly the most important, and what areas need additional details so that the person I was speaking to would actually understand. And you'll probably end up with a list of here's the things I have to share, and here's the list of things I could add each time. Okay. So I want you then to think about how would I adapt this delivery to go other places? How would I, if I had long form and it's a LinkedIn post, if I had a blog post, if I had the About Us page on my website, how would I share this story? Conversely, if I was on a podcast and I had 30 seconds to answer this, how would I share the most important pieces? And just think about it. What of this outline is the most important? What gets enough of my story out that people lean in and go, I'd like to hear some more? That's what we're going for here. Okay. You don't need to spend your days creating and generating story after story after story in your business. You need to have a handful of stories that you can share over and over again. In this case, you need one version, maybe 2, of your origin story that you can share again and again and again. The only thing that changes, once again, based on your audience, is how many of the details you're going to add. Okay, but it's a whole lot easier to remember, hey, there's like 3 things I know I have to say. The rest is just icing on the cake. Okay. That's how I want you to start thinking about the story that you've got to tell. Not, did I say the phrase exactly right? Did the heart of what I had to say get conveyed to the person across from me? And then figure out ways to repeat this thing. Think about all the ways you could share this and start figuring out how you could start dropping this story in its various forms into those locations. Okay. Think about all those places because the story is your bridge between who you are and who you're called to reach and serve. And so you're going to have to share it. You're going to have to repeat it. And as you do, watch what begins to happen because people will begin to see clarity. Just like I said with Phil Robertson, I didn't grow tired of hearing the same story 3 times because it wasn't a rote iteration of the story every time. There was variations to it. Okay. You don't need more marketing in your business. You need a story that people can remember and repeat. They're only going to be able to repeat it if you've gotten it so clear that it's repeatable. So I would encourage you, walk through this 6-step process. Walk through specifically using your origin story, figuring out, how can I talk about the things I do? How can I talk about the people I serve in this context with my audience in mind? So I'm sharing the details that are most important to them, not the details that I think are the most important for me to get out of my mouth. Thank you for being with me today. I know this is a little bit different than how I typically share, because I really want to help you walk through and figure out, how can you actually apply some of these things into your business, into your stories. If you ever walk through a workshop like this, is we would take this process and like expand it out. Okay. This is a origin stories is a 2 to 2.5, even 3 hour process when we're face to face, of really diving in and figuring out the nuances and practicing it and getting the words out of our head into our mouth so we actually share them in a way that makes sense. Okay. That only happens as you practice, as you work through. So here's the reality. If you've been following me for a while, you know that story is really important to me. And there are 2 ways that you can think about story in your business. Okay. There are the personal stories that you need to share. Okay. It's the origin story, like we talked about today. It's how you introduce yourself. It's how you talk about your authority in ways that don't make you feel cringy. It's how you share testimonials about your business. It's the things that you've got stories, they're just not in a repeatable way, and you need to figure out how to focus them so your audience goes, yes, I want to know more. Okay. Those are the kind of things I love doing. And the second piece is what I call brand clarity work. And brand clarity work really is the business's side of the stories you tell. Okay. You have a foundation. You've got work you've done. You've got people you've served, but you need a stronger foundation of, how are we going to communicate across all platforms the importance of the work we do and the messaging about the products that we have. Specifically, if the personal side is you as the business owner, the business leader, the brand clarity is, what is the brand saying, so that the two work together. Okay. Those are the 2 areas of work that I absolutely love doing. So a lot of times in this podcast, we lean more towards the personal side, and then we'll have guests that kind of push us towards the brand clarity side. But those are really the 2 lanes. And if you're looking at your business and going, man, I want to be on more stages. I want to be on more podcasts. I want opportunities to share my story with a little more clarity, where the words have actually got to come out of my mouth, or I've got to shoot video. I'd encourage you to reach out and ask about help with your personal stories and how to clarify them so that they're repeatable, just like we talked about today. If you conversely are one of those business owners, you're going, we've got a pretty solid foundation, but there seems to be some disconnect. Like, leads come in and we kind of lose them in the mix, and we maybe need some help clarifying our offers so that everyone understands this is what our offers are and how we're talking about those, and we align our team members even on all of our messaging goals and things. Contact me about brand clarity work and how we could help. Some of these you'll feel like, hey, this feels more like a workshop. Other times you'll feel more like, oh, this feels more like a strategy session. And that's just part of the work. I would love to lean in and help your business to solve either of these sides of your messaging platform, because at the end of the day, it is your story. The only question is, how are you going to share it? Whether it's coming out of your mouth personally, or it's the brand doing the talking online and all the ways you share, you have a story to share. And in the absence of a clear story, people will fill the void with a story that is not yours. Make sure they have the words to fill in the story that you want repeated each and every time. I'm Ryan Holck. This has been Brand on the Rocks. I appreciate you for being here. As always, you can like and love the podcast, specifically on iTunes, but we're also on most of the other platforms. Check it out. Follow the show. Please share it with a friend, especially if you've got friends that when you're talking to them, you're going, I have no idea what story you just told. I don't know what I'm supposed to take away with that story. Send them my way. Have them listen. Let's engage and help them because your stories matter. Your business matters. Let's make sure people understand what that means and the difference you can make in helping other people win. Until next time, blessings.